thinking about shame, it's more intractable than guilt. We're accustomed to think of the antidote to guilt as repentance and forgiveness, or maybe as repentance, forgiveness, and penance. Shame, however, is a response to one's deformity in consequence of something in the history of one's life. And that history, like everything else about the past, is fixed and unalterable. On the view of virtually all philosophers and theologians, even God can't change the past. So one's life history remains what it was. For these reasons, a remedy for shame seems much harder to come by than a remedy for guilt. So the problem of human sin is both future-looking and backward-looking, and it includes three elements, you might say: current dispositions with their liability to future sin, and past sinful actions with their consequent guilt and shame. Insofar as the atonement is a solution to the problem of sin, these are the elements of the problem that it must somehow remedy if it is to be a successful solution. The long, complicated history of interpretation of the doctrine of the atonement is marked by three main kinds of theories about the obstacles to any remedy for the problem of the human tendency to sin. The first of these theories, popular in the patristic period and much more neglected since then, locates the main obstacle in the power of Satan. It sees Satan as having a hold over human beings because of the human tendency to evil. On this theory, in some morally or legally appropriate way, human sin put human beings in the control of Satan, who held sway over them with some justice or some, as it were, legal rights. By trying to extend his control over human beings to the incarnate deity in the passion and death of Christ, Satan somehow lost whatever justice or legal rights he had with regard to his domination of human beings. In consequence, through the effects of Christ's passion and death on the reign of Satan, human beings were redeemed from slavery to sin. Now, whatever the interest or the merits of this patristic kind of theory may be, it's hard to see interpretations of this kind as full or complete accounts of the doctrine of the atonement. How could an interpretation of this kind explain the removal of either guilt or shame, for example? And of course, at least from the time of Anselm onwards, other types of theories have eclipsed this one. Historically considered, this patristic theory has been in abeyance for a long time. The two main competing kinds of theories, from Anselm's time onwards, are divided by their preference for locating the main obstacle to the remedy for human sin, either in God or in human beings. You might naturally suppose that these two different kinds of theory are the Catholic and the Protestant kinds. You might, especially in this audience, suppose that. But this would be a mistaken way of categorizing the kinds in question. In my view, there are Catholic interpretations to be found in both the different kinds of theories. It is less easy to say whether Protestant interpretations come in both kinds as well, but that's at least in part because it's not always easy to interpret the details of the major Protestant theories. Still, it's not hard to see the interpretations of the atonement given by Calvin and Luther as falling largely or entirely into one kind of theory. Anselm's interpretation of the doctrine should be assigned to this kind too. On the accounts of the interpretations in this group, the chief obstacle to the remedy for human sin lies in something about God. The other kind of theory can be suitably represented by the interpretation of the doctrine given by Aquinas. For this second kind of theory, the primary impediment to finding a solution for the problem of human sin lies in human beings themselves. In this short paper, all I can do is to sketch the lineaments of these two kinds of interpretations and the difficulties attending each of them. I'll begin with the first kind, the Anselmian kind of theory. Interpretations of the doctrine of the atonement, suitably grouped into that first Anselmian kind, often locate the main obstacle to a solution to the problem of human sin in God's honor or God's justice or some similar divine attribute or attributes. as the proponents of interpretations in this first kind see it. In consequence of their proneness to sin, human beings have violated God's righteous commands or otherwise acted contrary to God's goodness, and so have offended God. This offense against God generates something like a moral debt, and that debt is so enormous that human beings by themselves can never repay it. Although God has the power to cancel the debt, in some sense of power, he is nonetheless unable to do so. That's because it would be a violation of God's justice to cancel a moral debt, or it would be in some other way incompatible with his goodness, or it would be a blot on his honor, or something else along these lines. Instead, God's justice or honor or some other divine attribute requires that the full debt owed be paid. Therefore, God cannot simply forgive a person's sin. Instead, because of the relevant divine attributes, God must impose the just punishment for human sin. In his influential treatise on the Atonement, Cur Deus Homo, which gives us one classic exemplar of such interpretation of the doctrine, Anselm says, "There is nothing more intolerable in the universal order than that a creature should take away honor from the Creator and not repay what he takes away. There is nothing which it is more unjust to tolerate than the most intolerable thing in the universal order. It is a necessary consequence, therefore, that either the honor which has been taken away should be repaid, or punishment should follow. Otherwise, either God will not be just to himself, or he will be without the power to enforce either of the two options. And it is an abominable sin even to consider this possibility." Interpretations of the doctrine of the atonement in this first kind of theory consequently tend to emphasize the passion and death of Christ as paying the penalty for human beings. On interpretations in this first kind of theory, then, God is not only perfectly just, but also infinitely merciful, and so he brings it about that he himself pays the human debt in full, by assuming human nature as the incarnate Christ, and in that nature enduring the penalty which would otherwise have had to be imposed in justice on human beings. And then, because the incarnate Christ has paid in full the penalty owed by human beings, human sins are forgiven. For this reason, by God's mercy exercised through Christ's passion and death, human beings are saved from sin. Anselm sums up this view by saying, "The restoration of human nature could not have been brought about unless man repaid what he owed to God. This debt was so large that although no one but man owed it, only God was capable of repaying it, assuming that there should be a man identical with God. The life of this man is so sublime and so precious that it can suffice to repay the debt owed for the sins of the whole world and infinitely more besides." By contrast, interpretations of the doctrine suitably grouped into the second kind of theory typically locate the obstacle to a remedy for human sin in human beings themselves. In my view, Aquinas' interpretation of the doctrine is a good exemplar of this second kind. For Aquinas, the chief obstacle to human salvation from sin is that a human will doesn't will the good, or even want to will the good. By the objective, non-relativized standards of God, every human being except Christ has a will infected with the radical human tendency toward moral evil. On the interpretation of the atonement that Aquinas inherits and develops, the solution to the problem of human sin consists in the paired processes of justification and sanctification. On Aquinas' view, without violating human free will, God's operative grace produces in a human being a will for a will that wills the good, and God's cooperative grace works with that partially healed human will to increase in it the strength for willing the good. For Aquinas, Christ's passion and death produced many good effects for human beings, but the main one is that of providing the grace that heals the defect in the human will through the processes of justification and sanctification. So, for example, Aquinas says, grace was bestowed on Christ not only as an individual, but inasmuch as he is the head of the church, so that grace might